So let's take a deep look back and see how presidents have used this power over time. President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. At least 13,000 people, perhaps as many as 38,000, were arrested for crimes ranging from draft evasion to disloyal speech. Shortly after the Civil War ended, the Supreme Court considered the constitutionality of the suspension of the great writ of habeas corpus. And they ruled in 1866 that the government couldn't do it, even in times of war and insurrection, if the civil courts were opening and functioning. Writing for the court, Justice David Davis said, and I quote, "The Constitution is a law for rulers and people, equally in war and peace. And it covers with the shield of its protection all classes of men, at all times and under all circumstances. No doctrine involving more pernicious consequences was ever invented by the wit of man than that any of its provisions can be suspended." They wrote better in the 19th century. He continued, "Such a doctrine leads directly to anarchism or despotism." The fear of anarchy in this country led to the establishment of America's first truly secret intelligence service in the years before World War I. It was a crude instrument that became known as the General Intelligence Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In 1919, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, appointed a 24-year-old Justice Department lawyer to run the Intelligence Division, and his name was J. Edgar Hoover, that's right. It was a time of great fear right after World War I. The Bolsheviks had taken power in Moscow, anarchists were preaching revolution in the streets of New York and Chicago, and a terrorist group, and to this day nobody knows who it was setting off bombs, and one shattered the front rooms of the home of Attorney General Palmer himself in Georgetown. His next door neighbor, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, came running to help him. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1919. Attorney General Palmer called the bombings, quote, "an attempt on the part of radical elements to rule the country," and he ordered the young J. Edgar Hoover, 24 years old, to destroy these sinister forces. Hoover believed that the communists in Moscow were directing the labor strikes and race riots that were ripping through the country in 1919. And using wiretapping, warrantless searches, break-ins, undercover agents, and confidential informants, he gathered files on suspects across America. From November 1919 to January 1920, Hoover's General Intelligence Division arrested somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people in 33 cities on suspicion of holding radical ideas. Hoover and Palmer acted without legal authorization, without regard to due process, and without warrants. Upon review, more than 9 in 10 of those arrested were innocent even of disloyal ideas. The rest were summarily deported. And these arrests we now know as the Palmer Raids, but they should, upon review, be known as the Hoover Raids. By any name, they were a dark chapter in American history. When the great fears of 1919 began to subside during the 1920s, the federal government released from prison every single person that had been convicted under the wartime sedition laws. And in 1924, a new Attorney General, Harlan Fiske Stone, told the American people, and I quote, "A secret police is a menace to free government and free institutions." Stone sacked the corrupt and venal head of the FBI that year, and he appointed a new acting chief on the condition that he must end the FBI's surveillance of political radicals, and he must concentrate solely on the investigation of federal crimes. And the new candidate agreed. And he was, of course, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover ran the FBI from 1924 to 1972. He swore he would lay off the secret intelligence and secret police work, but he never did. He believed from the start that the FBI was a secret intelligence service as well as a law enforcement agency. He was always willing to use what he later called, quote, clearly illegal, unquote, methods, like warrantless break-ins, bugging, and wiretapping. He knew illegally gathered evidence could not be used in court. But he never wanted to use it in court. He wanted to use it as an instrument of political warfare to sabotage and to subvert the enemies of the United States. Government wiretapping had been banned by federal laws, barred by rulings by successive attorney generals, and in 1937 and 1939, decisions of the Supreme Court. But in 1940, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, called in J. Edgar Hoover to the White House, and in no uncertain terms, and this is in writing, FDR ordered Hoover to keep on wiretapping and bugging suspected Nazis, suspected communists, suspected America Firsters, isolationists, and assorted domestic political enemies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR's approval of these clearly illegal techniques remained in force, in secret, for the next 22 years. One of his attorney generals, one of FDR's attorneys general named Francis Biddle, wrote many years later, quote, "This opened the door pretty widely to wiretapping of anyone suspected of subversive activities," unquote. The authority for these acts devolved to Hoover because attorneys general didn't want to touch it. It was clearly illegal and arguably unconstitutional and had been outlawed by the Supreme Court. World War II brought a new era to American intelligence. The attack at Pearl Harbor had been the greatest intelligence failure since the Trojan horse. And after the war was over, it was widely understood that bits and pieces of information that could have been signs or signals of the attack had been scattered about the Army and the Navy and the FBI, but no one possessed all the pieces of the puzzle or the power to assemble them, so nobody saw the big picture. President Truman and Hoover himself saw the need for a central intelligence agency. But the proposal came from a man whom Truman distrusted and Hoover hated, Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS. Harry Truman really distrusted this man. And in September 1945, 6 weeks after the end of the war in Japan, he disbanded the OSS and he shelved Donovan's proposal to create the CIA. Truman said that a peacetime spy service might become, in his words, an American Gestapo. And he didn't want that to happen. 2 years later, he reversed himself, and he created the CIA in 1947. The CIA, like the FBI, has never had a legal charter. Its powers have never been clearly defined or delimited. The CIA was created much like the FBI with a stroke of a pen. The Attorney General back in 1909 under Teddy Roosevelt was a guy named Charles Bonaparte. Yes, the grandnephew of Napoleon. And he reassured Congress, quote, "The FBI would never be used for political purposes or any purposes clearly outside the legitimate work of federal law enforcement." But as we've seen 10 years later, the FBI became a secret police. Allen Dulles, in the hearings that created the CIA, reassured Congress a few hundred men was all that would be required. Abroad, you will need scores rather than hundreds, unquote. Dulles never spoke of covert operations, only of gathering intelligence. When he took over at CIA under President Eisenhower, he inherited a force of more than 10,000 people. And he immediately set about trying to overthrow the governments of Iran and Guatemala. During the 1950s, however, to Ike's great credit, he looks better all the time, doesn't he, President Eisenhower, as the years go by. To Ike's great credit, the CIA never spied on Americans. It was opening thousands of pieces of first-class mail, but that was a counterintelligence operation aimed against the Soviet Union. And to Dulles' credit, the CIA in the 1950s did not become, as Harry Truman had feared, an American Gestapo or a secret police. No, the FBI had the field all to itself.